England, 1976.
They are punk rockers.
Disillusioned youth.
Raw, outrageous and crude.
Anarchy. Striking miners.
The new craze, they tell me.
Mountains of rubbish. The winter of discontent.
Worthless, nasty.
Societal decline. No future. Chaos.
They're a hero.
Welcome to Destroy, a podcast about how the punk movement of 1976 spawned a cultural revolution still being felt today.
You have to destroy in order to create.
One thing we know absolutely is that we don't know. It's an absolute truth that we don't know what the future is.
It's been almost 50 years since the Sex Pistols played their first gig at St. Martin's School of Art. Their provocative attitude and bombastic demeanor infected many. Incensed, one man tore down a student's profane degree show, and another destroyed his TV. In Chelsea, Vivienne Westwood's store, Seditionaries quickly became a place for outcasts and misfits. Worshipping her subversive clothing and sexualized bondage wear, they shattered the sedate English composure. At the same time, former Vogue art director Terry Jones launched street style magazine ID, which brilliantly captured it all. And as the late 70s quickly turned into the early 80s and birth of MTV, a new wave of auteures emerged, experimenters in videography and storytelling, defining a whole new category of cinematic art. And within just a few years, the influence of punk was already transporting a new generation of creative pioneers into our living rooms. I'm Richard Smith, and I'm your host. I'm an art director and a filmmaker. In episode 3 of Destroy, we meet a true visionary, someone who took the torch handed to him by punk in 1975 and is still running with it today. Destroy, the Influence of Punk is produced by Be Right Back Studios, a full-service video and audio production company specializing in providing strategically driven original content. Founded on the belief that context gives everything meaning, Be Right Back Studios provides over 35 years of industry expertise and is more than just a production partner. Visit BeRightBackStudios.com to learn more. My guest today has had a mind-blowing career. In many ways, the trajectory of his work epitomizes the concept for this show. He's gone from Sex on the King's Road to Lawnmower Man in Hollywood. He's worked with Iggy Pop, Siouxsie and the Banshees, The Clash, as well as Steven Spielberg, Tim Burton, and David Fincher, and Nike, Ford, and Boeing. Oh yeah, he also teaches narrative design at the University of California. He believes in demolishing boundaries and that we should question everything. He's an inspiration and a genius. Please welcome the very talented, the amazing Mr. Alex McDowell. Alex, thank you for being on the show. I appreciate you making this early morning call.
Thank you, Richard.
Should we get started? So I'm going to kind of go back to the beginning, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it seemed that when you saw the Sex Pistols perform at Central St. Martin's in 1975, it opened up a window into the future for you. What do you think you saw in that moment back in 1975? Do you remember?
I do. I think as much as the fogs of time allow, it was instantly transformative. It's interesting because it seems difficult to imagine that something could have that kind of spontaneous impact. But
right.
Yeah, I saw them play supporting Adam and the Ants at St. Martin's, and then the next day they came and headlined, and they got thrown off the stage.
Oh, funny.
And so they headlined at Central School of Art, which is where I was commissioning the bands, and I'd met Glenn Matlock basically coming in and offering to have a band to play for free. And so of course we leapt out. I had no idea who the Sex Pistols were, and you can imagine there was an audience full of art students who were mostly into rockabilly, wearing draped jackets. That was what was going on at that time. And John Rotten was who he is and who he was known as from the moment he stepped on stage. His persona was fully formed. The band was perhaps a little more traditional kind of rock and roll at that point, but he was completely mind-blowing. And it was incredibly attractive to me. I was in this space as a painter, but already pushing a little bit against the convention. I mean, we were certainly brought up with 60s painters, but kind of moving into the idea of how you can push against the edges with that. And so right away, it was like, okay, how can I use my art to be completely subversive, but how can I work with these guys? And so, because I got to know Glenn quite well, I contacted Malcolm McLaren. I was taken on as their photographer and
How interesting.
traveled to the Chalet du Lac gig, which was one of the earliest gigs in Paris, traveled in the back of the van and up to Manchester and got embedded pretty quickly. And then they saw my photographs, half of which came out unexposed and completely terrible. And so I got fired as photographer. It's actually funny because I've found a lot of those pictures again. And actually, Glenn's using them in a documentary he's making, and they're actually not as bad as maybe I thought they were. But so then I was in touch with Vivienne Westwood pretty much as a free printer because we were using the art school screen printing facility, and started printing all of the T-shirts for Sex and then for Seditionaries.
You were also designing them, or was it?
No, really not. We were assembling them. We were working with the original artwork. I think my handwriting is on the Destroy T-shirt. But on the whole, it was really very much providing a service to Vivienne, but working closely and literally printing every T-shirt they sold. And I was being paid in clothing, and it was really fun. But at that point, my art was getting very subversive. I was getting close to my final show. My final show had very sex-based bondage and extreme art, and the vice principal came to the final show and ripped my art from the walls and wouldn't let anybody into my little booth. And so I could have made great press out of that now, but at the time,
Right.
it didn't really make a big impact.
Right.
But he literally tore up my drawings.
But that must have been, I don't know, devastating. Or maybe you just turned around and said, F you.
It was confirmation, really, that it was working.
Right.
It's kind of great. And then Terry Jones, who was the art director at Vogue, came to that show and equally trying to really shake things up. He left Vogue and started ID magazine, and ID was photocopied in the same way as all the fanzines at that time, stapled and photocopied by this group called Better Badges in Notting Hill, who was printing every magazine, sniffing glue, etc. And so I worked as an editor on the first 4 issues of ID magazine with Terry. And again, it really was shaking things up. He was reinventing what graphics were. He was reinventing street fashion, how you capture it, how you portray it. So it was this sort of transformative moment of seeing the Pistols on stage immediately reverberated. And, you know, I'm here now because of that night. It's ridiculously simplistic, but I think most of what led to me becoming a designer in film, for example, came directly from starting to get involved in music graphics.
Looking through everything that you've done since that moment, and even now and into the future, there seems to be this strong connection of deliberately wanting to push against convention. So just going back to something you said, you struck up a friendship with Glenn Matlock from the Pistols, the original bass player, and you founded Rockin' Russian together. Is that right?
That's right.
So he was in The Rich Kids, I think, around this time. What was your scheme?
So I started really working with Glenn, traveling around the country, finding the band for The Rich Kids. I went on the road with him and went from gig to gig and meeting musician to musician until he assembled the band. So I was super privileged in terms of being able to get into that alliance with Glenn. And then he basically said, I need a record sleeve, and funded the starting of Rockin' Russian in order for us to do the Rich Kids graphics. And the first piece of art was just a red square for the single. I was, Rockin' Russian was based in the Russian constructivist graphics that were my main influence. So doing a Bel Lissitzky red square was the start point. But yeah, that was it. That's what started it. And then it was logical to start being available to other bands.
Right.
And there were only two or three graphic designers. Barney Bubbles had preceded the generation before, let's say, doing the Elvis Costello, amazing
Right.
transformative graphic designer in music. But I was working alongside Malcolm Garrett and Peter Saville, and eventually people like Neville Brody, who worked for me. But Rockin' Russian was doing its own little corner. Peter and Malcolm were working out of Manchester, and there was certainly a lot of people beginning to design record sleeves, but we were given a head start because of Glenn getting started early on.
You know, it must have been a great entree into the world of music and doing work for bands and musicians. And I know then all of that led to you directing, I think, 3 videos for Iggy Pop. And that's where you met Tim Pope. Is that correct?
Slightly later with Tim, but Glenn still being very important in my career because he was working as Iggy Pop's bass player by that point. This was post Rich Kids. I'd done a lot of record sleeves by then, but yeah, Iggy said, did we know anyone who could make music videos? I've heard about this thing called music videos. And we said, yeah, we can do that. We didn't know what a music video was, but it was it was an opportunity. And I was working with a great photographer called Brian Griffin. So we asked him to be cinematographer, and he'd never done that. And it was completely improvised. And then it was £3,000 for 3 videos, and it was him in a fridge, basically. It was very simple, but it did kickstart the access. But then I started working with Peter Kerr, who is amazing. I did things like Depeche Mode with him, and I think very quickly met Tim. And Tim was even then working with The Cure, and I think we did 6 Cure videos together, but lots and lots of work in music video. We were doing, at the height of that time in London, I was doing 3 music videos at a time, and they were one a week, because you would get the go. A band would be moving up the charts. They would say, okay, we need a music video. You would hear about it on Monday. You'd write the script on Tuesday. You'd shoot on Wednesday. You'd edit on Friday. And then it was on Top of the Pops on Saturday. So, there's never been anything like it, and there will never be anything like it again. I think it's impossible to get that focus that music videos had, because there were only so many genres, and there was a lot of impetus and money from the record companies, because MTV ultimately became the main platform to sell on. The rapid turnaround and the economic impact of MTV at that time was massive. And by the time I got to the States, Tim and Peter were both starting to get work from American bands, and we would go over to the States quite frequently. And then we went to do a Bananarama video, and then that got changed and became a Robbie Neville video, who was up and coming at that time. And we never went back. I mean, I went back 6 months later to pick up my clothes, essentially. And in 1986, I moved permanently to the US.
What's really interesting to me is that in many ways, you were taking that do-it-yourself ethos of punk and really like, oh yeah, we can do a video, no problem, having never done a video before. Now it just seems like, what do you mean? But was this something that you were pursuing deliberately, or was it just really a matter of being in the right place at the right time?
I think it was primarily being in the right place at the right time. I would say that my career has been this series of falling off a cliff, falling forward, not having any idea of the implication of taking the next step. But I'm very curious and easily bored, I would say. And I think that has driven my career. That sort of possibility of something like music video. It remains true that anarchy is persistent, and I think it's an anarchic space that, I'm always drawn to something that's going to be disruptive. And I think, it's hard for me to engage in something that appears to be conventional or following any kind of conventional pathway. And Music videos were anarchic in every way. They were not recognized by the union.
Right.
It wasn't recognized as a form at all. Directors, they were coming out of film school or even not. And the crews you were working with were just people you met yesterday who seemed like they'd be cool to work with. And obviously it formalized pretty quickly by the time I got to LA and I was working with production companies like Limelight and Propaganda. It was beginning to be a really powerful economic machine. And by the time that I was doing Madonna videos with David Fincher, the budgets were insane. You know, I think that the Michael Jackson video we did was $10 million. So we went from £3,000 to that scale of almost feature
Insane.
film. Yeah, insane. If there was a vision that a director had or a musician had and they were a pop star, then it would really be whatever it needed to be. I mean, David Fincher was hiring Jordan Cronowith, at that time the greatest cinematographer in the industry in Hollywood, to shoot Madonna video. There was this incredible energy of directors who had not had a foot into filmmaking, were
Right.
the young blood, up and coming, competing with Ridley Scott in commercials and that kind of thing. And music videos catapulted those directors. They became the massively successful directors we know now. And a lot of their music videos were ways for them to start playing with the form and beginning to use feature film language. And that's why music videos became more and more sophisticated, because directors were really using them as a platform into feature film.
So in the beginning, you really built a reputation and obviously have continued to build on that reputation of being, like you said, disruptive or pushing against the grain or whatever, however you want to describe it. Going back a little bit, after Rocking Russian and all of that, you then set up the Gamma, I believe, with John Warwicker, and then continued to do videos. And then it was at that moment you decided to relocate to Los Angeles. I know you said you're easily bored, but why did you decide to go down the production design path?
I was already deeply embedded in design with music graphics and doing every aspect of graphic design. I think I was very clear that I was a designer. I wasn't an artist. I wasn't a painter. I was used to working on commission and solving the problems that were put in front of me. I went into music video as a designer. And I think on reflection, I was a production designer on day one, because that's really what I was doing. It really was what interested me. I didn't want to be a director. I didn't have the capability to be a cinematographer. Those were the three roles that were interesting. And I certainly wasn't a producer. But it wasn't really anything more than I was really in love with design. And each of those music videos became another opportunity to test the waters of how far you could push design or how could you solve problems. We weren't always doing radical design, but it was always solving problems. And so production design, I cannot imagine a more open and stimulating design form, because narrative design requires so many aspects of your brain to make it work. You're looking at 360-degree environment. You're looking at emotional and empathetic context for actors. You're looking at the nuance of embedding an audience into the space that is fictional that you're designing, that's only going to exist for the one day that it's being filmed, but has to engage an audience forever. And it has to be deeply embedded in narrative. And then if you're doing a film in 17th century Paris, then you're embedding yourself in what it means to be someone living in the 17th century in Paris. And if you're doing something like Minority Report, you're living in a future that doesn't yet exist, that nobody knows what it's going to be. And you're getting engaged in what the future means and how do you engage an audience to the extent that they believe it. And so as a narrative designer, it's always about time and space, and it's always about embedding emotion and empathy. And looking at all of the vectors that involves, it's constantly engaging. I've never been bored in film.
Hey there, sorry for the interruption, but if you're enjoying the show, please leave a review or a comment. For the latest news and updates, make sure to also follow us on Instagram at Destroy Punk Podcast. Thank you, and now back to the show. A lot of the movies you've made, they are immaculate in their totality. They encompass every detail, every fictional detail. Fight Club with David Fincher, you mentioned Minority Report with Steven Spielberg. You've worked several times with Tim Burton, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. It seemed like you were on a natural trajectory to land where you are today, and narrative design. And you touched on this too, this idea that design is 5-dimensional or 360, spherical. Mm-hmm. Explain that a little further, that you just touched on it just now.
First of all, my definition of 5 dimensions is that volume plus time is a base, is a given with film. Your time is an aspect of production design that doesn't exist, let's say, for example, in architecture. An architect is designing a container that is going to exist through time, but it is an object that is solidified, and it doesn't evolve in real time. It doesn't shift and change to a large extent. The same with a piece of furniture or clothing. You can make lots of arguments about how they're transformed by the human occupant, etc. But as a designer in narrative, you are designing and redesigning every second, if you like. Your design is evolutionary, and it's changed by its inhabitants. And the 360 part of it is, even though a camera is pointing at in a specific direction in a specific time and essentially becomes a two-dimensional plane in that 3D space, as a designer, you have to design for the possibility that the camera might look anywhere, for example.
Right.
As a designer, you're having to deal with the possibilities that an actor could do anything in that space, and that you have to empower and support what the actor and the story need. So the 360 part is that literally you're building a container in pretty much every set. Every major set you build, you're building a set which is shot over and over again. When we shot The Terminal with Steven Spielberg, I mean, when that film was made, the camera was in there for 3 months. So there was no corner that wasn't going to be filmed, and it was the size of an airport terminal, and it had to have every possible aspect that an airport terminal would have, down to the coffee cup. So right. In that sense, that's the 4D space, right? And then the 5D, and I think this is where I had the opportunity to embed narrative myself. So not following the script. At least the script is always the template in film, but increasingly, as you understand that your role is proactive as a designer, you're not just there to follow the orders of the director and the script. You're there to assert an influence on the way the narrative develops. And at that point, as a storyteller, let's say in the visual sense, the 5th dimension is story. So the time space is brought to life because it has a function to tell a story. And if the story asserts an influence on both the time and the space, then it's a completely proactive element of the way in which design evolves through time-space. And in many ways, the reasoning, the kind of driving force of the decisions you make about the spatial design and its relationship to time. So the 5 dimensions, in my view, those are inextricable when you're a narrative designer. Just a quick leap into the present. I am running a design studio that solves problems, and I'm leading the drive towards solving those problems. So there is no director. There are business partners. There's the equivalent of producers, but we're completely in charge of the way the narrative drives the design. Yeah, so as a designer, I'm responsible, let's say, for the impact of visual storytelling in the storytelling space. We're not necessarily influencing the actors, but we are contextualizing their performance.
What I think it sounds like to me is it is every detail of what you're looking at tells a story beyond the story that you're hearing or the actors are saying, right? So looking at the way the character of a building, the character of the elements within that space, they tell a story and evoke something.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, if you take something like Sleep No More, the theatrical space, which exists on multiple different planes in multiple spaces with actors simultaneously acting in a four-dimensional space, so it's no longer stage-based. At that point, the audience is in a relationship with the actor that gives them the freedom to make decisions about what part of that environment is emotive for them or frames the narrative. And you can sit in a room and open drawers, and the drawers are full of artifacts that support that story of Macbeth. And that's the kind of logic. Even though in film you don't have that interactive component, we do fill the drawers with a supporting set of artifacts and letters that are written in the voice of the actor. And so some of the time, I think a lot of the time, our job is to make sure that the actor feels immersed. Their performance is driven by how much they believe, not just the story, but in the space that they're inhabiting. And so in that sense, it's kind of behind the scenes, but it's having an impact. And then if you take the extreme examples like Fight Club, we designed the Paper Street house from the ground up as a narrative that was not scripted. There was no directive. David Fincher is extremely involved in a directive sense as a director, but we had to solve a design problem, which was how do you convince the audience that two people are actually three people? And that's the entire premise of Fight Club. But we had to build a set that would allow the actors, Brad Pitt and Ed Norton, to leave the room and enter the room believably and never be in the same room at the same time with the Helena Bonham Carter character. And so we were designing a theater set as a French farce, essentially. And so to do that, we were embedding a narrative of a Victorian house with servants' entrances and a second staircase that was developed in the 1960s to sublet a rental space within the house to give two staircases and two entrances and exits for every room. And so as an example, I feel like that is the essence of narrative design, is that that you're solving extremely complex problems and they require design solutions. You're designing a machine that has to support a narrative that is invisible, essentially. But 90% of the work is in designing the machine so that in that 360 surface, it's capable of functioning to support a very complex piece of narrative and not allow the audience to see the machine. So there's a lot of nuance to that. But as you understand your role as a designer to be at that level of proactivity, you take that responsibility on, and in the sense that making sure you're not bored, I'm looking for solving problems, in the most complicated way possible. With Man of Steel, when we invented an entire language for Krypton, it wasn't strictly necessary for the film. It became an embellishment, and you see the words in Krypton embedded in walls and in the character of the space, but the joy of that, if you like, is how do you build a new language from the ground up in 3 months?
You must have an amazing book collection. I don't know how all of this could be in your head.
It's a great observation. I think I have 10,000 books, and I think that's a result of buying 500 books on every show. It's really like that. You're carrying boxes and boxes full of books because that was the driver. My library right now is the outcome of taking 500 books to a show and then bringing them back and putting them wherever they fit on the shelves. I've got the most randomized collection of books you can possibly imagine. Absolutely no system. The only system is that it's absolutely randomized. And the reason even to mention that is that's how my brain works. And I think that's how we work as designers. You take stimulus as much as anything from the way they rub up against each other, and the unexpected third solution comes from seeing two different inputs.
Right.
And I think that's a fair reflection, I think, for me, how design evolves is that you see these accidental juxtapositions and then you leap where they take you.
Not to generalize, but a lot of creative minds, people like yourself who are real creative pioneers, they take in so much around them and then translate that somehow into something that has a physical or whatever sense. So much of what you're doing is really pushing the boundaries of reality and fiction. Do you feel like your life is a constant fantasy? Are we living in the Matrix? You must constantly be questioning reality.
No, it's a really interesting observation and something I haven't really ever talked about, but I think that as a designer, I am interested in solving problems. And when those problems are put in front of me, I immerse myself, and I have a system for immersing myself and my team in a holistic world space that is completely absorbing. And our job is to live in that world space. But if I don't have that problem in front of me, then I don't think about it anymore. So in that sense, I don't live in that space until the problem in front of me requires that I do. But I think I'm different than a lot of the people that I hire, for example, the illustrators that I hire, who in their spare time are still drawing spaceships. You know, they are absolutely embedded in fan fiction and they're embedded in science fiction and inventing. And my particular flaw is that I just stop thinking about it the moment it's not there to be solved anymore. And so the advantage of that is that I can switch on and off. Like I run 3, 4, sometimes 5 projects at a time, and I can switch hour by hour to a completely different mind space because I don't live in any of them beyond the point at which I need to solve the problems. So in a sense, I would say that's not true. I don't live in the Matrix unless I'm in the Matrix.
You take the pill once you're ready.
Once I need to.
Right. A couple more questions. You started a program at the University of Southern California called World Building, or the World Building Lab. Obviously, you're looking to the future a lot in the work you do and the people you work with. And 2 questions. The USC, what are you trying to teach? Technology, the future, what do you see?
Yeah, I'm teaching a program called World Building, and I joined USC in 2012, and I stopped making films and designing films at that moment because it's impossible to be plugged into a program that has commitments to semesters and to work in film where you can get a call and say, be in Prague in 2 weeks. And I was very happy at that point to take a break from film. 22 films in, I felt like I'd got into a rhythm of the way in which I work with film where it was becoming less interesting. But I was carrying with me this idea that world building was a really powerful design system. And so when I was offered the opportunity to teach at USC, they weren't really sure what I was going to bring with me, but I was sure that world building was a discipline that was not understood and really not widely applied. Lots of people bandy that word around, and it's very valid in games. But in world building, you're designing a logic for a world that is evolutionary. I mean, I think at the very simplest, I'm teaching people to solve problems with media that don't yet exist. Media is changing so rapidly. Nobody really knew what VR would turn into or AR would turn into mixed reality, what is the combination of film and game. I've worked with people working in interactive media in Unreal who are making films with Unreal, with a game engine. They are interesting because they're films that you can change after they release because they're in a game engine. So you start tweaking at the edges of what these traditional media are. But you have to be massively adaptive. You have to be able to switch between disciplines. You have to understand 10 different disciplines simultaneously, and you have to react to them, respond to them all the time. And people in film school are being taught how to be a cinematographer. They're not being taught how to be a designer at the same time as being a cinematographer. But in world building, I think what we're basically trying to do is to say, the world doesn't work that way. It's not a linear system. Nobody lives in the world in a linear way. They're being influenced every second of the day by what's going on around them. And they're interacting with active narratives over which they have no control, but they are having to adapt to in order to survive or just get through their day. So there's a linear component to that, which is you're in a timeline that doesn't change. But that is in itself questionable. And so what I'm trying to say with world building is, let's see how a world really works and understand that it's a volatile environment, that it can change at any time. There could be a pandemic tomorrow or an earthquake, and our narrative will change. And we've got to be able to understand how to not just adapt to that, but to be proactive within that level of radical change that we're surrounded by. But if you're looking at embedding or investing in a narrative that has to work within a world that is not just delivering a product, but you're actually working out how to create or work within a volatile environment. And as a designer or as a practitioner in any discipline, you have to think about yourself in that space. So world building is saying you have to be able to design and develop with other participants. It's always collaborative. Everybody has equal and opposite influence on the way that world develops. They have to be adaptive, but they're very influential, and they are given enormous autonomy and freedom to say, I want to assert an influence on the way the world is going to behave, but it's within a very curated framework. So that it's not chaotic, it's not Second Life. You develop a framework, you develop a logic, you develop a set of rules, and then the world evolves within that, and the world is unexpected and it never ends up where you expected it to. And you are constantly influenced by a number of factors that change all the time because they evolve according to what the moving parts are and who has influence and what the tension is. So there's a sort of basis there of teaching people how to change the way they assert influence in the world. And we teach astrophysicists and biologists and journalists and economists and engineers alongside animators and filmmakers and game makers. So you have a very broad base, and they tend to be people who are banging against the wall. So they're very interested in breaking the edges of their own discipline.
You probably get asked this a lot, like, where do you see the future of humankind? I know that's a very big question, but what you just said and thinking about the punk movement and looking at the philosophies of your design company, Experimental Design, decode and disrupt, provoke, demolish boundaries. You've very much taken that spirit of 1975 and run with it. So back to my question, where do you see the future?
Yeah, I think that's true. I do think that remains the driving force for me, because in a way I feel like I'm just reacting to how the world works. It is disruptive. There are radical changes. There always have been, but it's so apparent now. We don't have the stories anymore. The example I would say is this: the class I'm teaching now is called Junk. And it assumes that our world as we know it has ended. We live 300 years in the future. We're looking back at a destroyed civilization, and we only have the building materials of the detritus that's left from that civilization once it's collapsed. And I've been teaching this now for 3 years, so 6 or 7 semesters. There's a consortium of 21 different universities and academies now in the world. And so we're all looking at a 300-year future, and we're all looking at where do we think it's going to go within the framework that develops that's completely in the power of the students at that moment, but always within that very specific premise. And so I feel like it's very symptomatic or representative of my process, which is set a kind of logical framework, set a start point, a context, but then allow it to go wherever it goes and react to that and exploit that and take advantage and run with wherever those ideas take you. So no prior knowledge, completely blank slate, which is a basic premise of my design practice, is that I know nothing about anything until I have to solve the problem. And in this case, we have 1,000 students trying to solve that problem. And in each case, they're saying, I don't know what's going to happen, but I have 300 years to discover. And in that process of discovering what the world might become, every single one of them is being stimulated to have to think outside of their framework, outside of their discipline, outside of any practice that they understand. And they solve problems at a massively complex level with radical solutions over and over again, because they're given the opportunity to destroy the world and rebuild it, and I think that is probably fundamentally what I'm interested in.
It's an interesting answer because it makes me think in many ways the future is unknown. It's uncertain. We don't know. You are in many ways posing that question through what you just described. It's brilliant.
That is right. I think one thing we know absolutely is that we don't know. It's an absolute truth that we don't know what the future is.
I love that. Al, thank you. I really appreciate it. I know I've kept you longer than we had slotted time, and I really appreciate you making this early morning call. So thank you.
You're very welcome. This is really great. Thank you. Your questions were brilliant.
You're clearly someone with a lot going on, and I am very grateful for you making the time. So thank you.
No problem.
Hope you get a break.
Yeah, thank you.
Cheers.
Absolutely.
Bye. My name is Richard Smith, and I'm your host. I'm a filmmaker and art director, and once upon a time I was part of the big 80s. I designed record covers for Depeche Mode, I danced with Bono, discussed art with Mick Jagger, and drank tea with Siouxsie. I also grew up during those turbulent times in England in the late 70s and was driven by the do-it-yourself ethos of punk. I obsessed over bands like Joy Division and New Order and went on to work for the album cover designer Peter Saville. I believe that year, that moment in 1976, when a bunch of foul-mouthed yobs cursed and swore on national television, changed the future of culture forever, and is what brought us to where we are today. So where do we go from here? Will emerging new technologies be the catalyst that tears down the walls of mediocrity, throwing culture and society into chaos and revolution again? We'll have to wait and see. This has been another episode of Destroy. Thank you for listening. Destroy is a Be Right Back Studios production. Learn more at berightbackstudios.com. And please tune in again for another episode of Destroy, the Influence of Punk podcast, wherever you listen or download.